When I was younger, people thought the danger came from the obvious places. They thought the threat to a family home was the mortgage payment you could not make, the bank notice you did not want to open, the recession everybody could see coming from 10 miles away. That is not what I learned. The older I got, the more I noticed something far more dangerous. The most expensive losses almost never come from the danger people prepare for. They come from the danger people never bothered to name. And if you are over 60, if your house is paid off, if you spent 30 or 40 years sending checks to a lender until the balance finally hit zero, you may be looking at the greatest illusion in personal finance. You may think you are safe. You may think that because there is no mortgage, there is no danger. You may think that because you own your home free and clear, the hardest part is behind you. I would tell you that this is exactly the moment when many people become the easiest target on the block. A paid-off home looks secure to the person living in it. It looks like peace. It looks like proof that the long years mattered. It looks like a wall around your life. But to the wrong eyes, it does not look like peace. It looks like idle equity. It looks like visible wealth. It looks like a vault with no guard standing at the door. That is the first thing I want you to understand. The moment your house is free and clear, the house stops looking ordinary to the outside world. It becomes a visible pile of stored labor. Decades of work sitting in one address, tied to one name, recorded in public systems that strangers can search in minutes. Most people do not think this way because most people are trained to think only in terms of income. They watch their pension, they watch Social Security, they watch the checking account, they watch the grocery bill, but the predators, the bureaucracies, the opportunists, and the collection systems are not always watching income first. Often they are watching equity. They are watching the part of your balance sheet that cannot defend itself. If your home is paid off, the danger is not only the burglar with a crowbar. In many cases, the more dangerous man is the one with a printer, a forged signature, a court judgment, a delinquency notice, or a lien. He does not need to break your window. He only needs you to be uninformed. I have seen people protect jewelry better than they protect a house. They buy a safe for a watch worth $8,000 and leave a home worth $600,000 sitting behind paperwork they never filed, protections they never claimed, and notices they never signed up for. That is backward. You do not lose a paid-off house because you were poor. You lose it because you were exposed. That exposure usually comes from 5 weak points. The first weak point is visibility. The second is unprotected equity. The third is bad title protection. The fourth is probate and poor estate structure. The fifth is tax delinquency and missed filing advantages. When you put those 5 together, you get the real retiree risk profile in modern America. A person who owns a house, a person with substantial equity, a person who believes that having no mortgage means having no threat, a person who often lives alone or manages household paperwork without much help, a person who assumes the county, the title company, the IRS, or the bank would somehow warn them before something serious happened. That assumption is where the whole tragedy begins. I want to walk through this the way I would explain it to a family I cared about, not like a bureaucrat, not like a lawyer billing by the hour, not like a list of forms on a county website. I want to explain it like a man who has lived long enough to see that wealth is not only built by buying assets, it is preserved by building friction around the assets you already have. That is what these documents really do. They build friction. They slow down the people who want to reach into your life and touch what is yours. They do not create perfection. They do not stop every threat, but they change the shape of the battlefield. And when you are older, that matters more than people realize. The first mechanism I want to name is the visibility trap. Most retirees do not understand how visible they are. Let's think privacy is normal because no one is standing on the sidewalk staring at the house. But that is not how modern targeting works. Nobody needs to stand outside your home anymore. They can search county records. They can see the owner name. They can see whether there is a mortgage. They can often infer age, life stage, and the likelihood that the owner has significant equity. To the wrong person, a paid-off home is not just a residence. It is a quiet balance sheet. That is why retirees with clear title are so attractive to the wrong crowd. The renter next door is not interesting. The family already drowning in debt is not interesting. The person with a fat pile of visible home equity and little structural protection is interesting. That is why the first paper matters so much. The Homestead Declaration is not glamorous. No one will brag about it at dinner. No one will post it on social media. But it is one of the clearest examples I know of how intelligent people quietly put a fence around their wealth. At its heart, the Homestead Declaration is a legal line in the dirt. It says that a certain amount of equity in your primary residence is protected from many unsecured creditors under state law. Now I want to be precise because sloppiness is expensive in this area. It does not stop a mortgage foreclosure. It does not magically erase federal tax power. It does not make every problem disappear. But for many ordinary creditor problems, judgments, collection pressure, personal debt exposure, medical collection exposure, and civil claims, it can be the difference between your home equity being vulnerable and your home equity being legally fenced off. What astonishes me is not that the form exists. What astonishes me is how many homeowners never file it. We live in a culture where people will spend weeks picking cabinet handles, backsplash patterns, and flooring colors, then spend zero time claiming a protection that could shield a meaningful part of their life savings. That is irrational. When I was younger, I thought wealth was mostly about a fence. I thought the game was finding wonderful businesses, wonderful investments, wonderful opportunities. The older I got, the more I realized that the people who remain wealthy are usually just as serious about defense. A homestead filing is defense. It is not exciting. It is not sexy. It is not a growth engine. It is a lock. And once you understand that, the psychology changes. You stop asking whether it is interesting. You start asking why on earth it is not already done. The second mechanism is the alert gap. This one is maddening because the cost of protection is often almost. Property fraud is one of those subjects people ignore because it sounds too strange to be real. They assume that no one can just fabricate ownership around a house. They assume there must be a full chain of human verification. They assume somebody in some office is checking carefully. That assumption can cost a fortune. A forged deed does not feel like the kind of thing that should work. But plenty of ugly things work for a while when the system is built on paperwork moving faster than scrutiny. The wrong person finds a property with clear equity. The wrong person fabricates a document. The wrong person records something against the property. Then the real owner discovers too late that the problem is no longer hypothetical. At that point, you are not paying for prevention. You are paying for correction, and correction is always more expensive. This is why I think free property fraud alerts are one of the most underrated tools available to older homeowners. Think about what the program really does. It shortens your reaction time. That is everything. In many financial disasters, the actual loss is not only caused by the event itself, it is caused by the delay between the event and your response. A forged filing caught in 24 hours is a problem. A forged filing caught after a loan has been pulled against your house, after a transfer has been acted on, after lawyers are involved, after confusion spreads into multiple offices, becomes an ordeal. If the county offers a fraud alert and you do not sign up, you are not just declining an email service, you are accepting slower discovery. In wealth protection, slow discovery is expensive discovery. That is a principle worth remembering far beyond housing. Good investors do not need to predict every blow-up. They need systems that tell them quickly when something changed. That is all a fraud alert is. It is a tripwire, and tripwires are cheap compared with lawsuits. The third mechanism is what I would call title illusion. Many people believe they are covered because they purchased title insurance at closing years ago. They remember signing a mountain of papers, hearing the phrase title insurance, and mentally filing the matter away forever. That is dangerous. The old policy many people carry is rear-facing. It covers defects and problems tied to the title before they bought the property. That is useful, but it is not the same thing as being protected from future fraud. The distinction is not academic. It is everything. If someone forges a deed after your closing date and your policy does not address that forward risk, the comforting belief that you are protected becomes just that, A belief. I have seen this pattern across finance. People do not love certainty nearly as much as they love the feeling of certainty. That feeling is often purchased with assumptions. Enhanced title protection matters because it deals with the world as it is, not the world as people wish it were. The world as it is includes fraud after closing. The world as it is includes identity, misuse, forged conveyances, and legal battles over ownership that arise long after the champagne from the closing table is forgotten. Now, I am not saying every homeowner must spend blindly on every ad, on someone offers. I hate lazy spending. I hate recurring costs piled on without thought. But I also hate false economies, saving a little on the front end and leaving yourself exposed to legal bills that could reach into 5 figures is not thrift. It is negligence wearing a cheap suit. One phone call to determine whether your policy is standard or enhanced is not a burden. It is due diligence. The fourth mechanism is probate drag and what I call the clean transfer problem. A house is not just an asset while you are alive. It is also a transaction waiting to happen after you are gone. Most people postpone this subject because it feels unpleasant. They do not want to picture incapacity. They do not want to picture death. They do not want to think about children arguing, courts moving slowly, public records opening up, or a surviving spouse standing in a hallway answering questions they do not fully understand, so they postpone structure. That is a mistake. A revocable living trust is not a magic wand, and it does not make creditors disappear during your lifetime. It is not a substitute for every other protection, but it solves a different class of problem, and it solves it elegantly. It changes ownership presentation. It can reduce the ease with which casual scammers target direct personal ownership. It keeps a major asset out of probate if properly funded. It allows transfer to move by design instead of delay. And it lets a family handle transition with more privacy and less public theater. What I like about trust planning, when done properly, is that it acknowledges a truth most families hate to admit. In moments of grief, confusion, or cognitive decline, clean systems matter more than good intentions. Everybody thinks the children will work it out. Everybody thinks the family is reasonable. Everybody thinks there will be time. Then life does what life always does. It introduces pressure. Pressure reveals every missing signature, every deed that was never retitled, every trust document that existed in theory, but was never matched by actual funding. A trust sitting in a drawer without the home titled into it is like a parachute still in the packaging. People confuse possession with deployment. Those are not the same thing. If you are going to build an estate structure, it has to be real. It has to hold the house. It has to reflect what you intend. And it has to be reviewed while you can still fix it calmly. The fifth mechanism is the tax trap. And this is the one people underestimate because they tend to think of taxes as annual nuisances rather than property threats. That is naive. When people talk about losing a home, they picture a bank. They rarely picture the county. They rarely picture a tax notice. They rarely picture interest, penalties, redemption timelines, delinquency procedures, and the ugly administrative machinery that can begin moving because an older homeowner had a medical shock, a spouse died, paperwork slipped, or a tax bill piled up during an already difficult year. But this machinery exists, and it does not care whether your intentions were honorable. One of the oldest lessons in finance is that institutions collect with systems, not feelings. The IRS is not sentimental. The county is not sentimental. The lien does not ask whether you have been a decent person. It simply attaches if the conditions are met. That is why staying current with taxes is not a side task. It is central to protecting the home. And this is also where many retirees miss hidden value in the other direction. They pay too much because they never filed for what they were entitled to. Senior property tax exemptions, assessment limitations, homestead tax benefits, local protections, these are not acts of charity. They are part of the system. But the system rarely drags you into the benefit line. You have to walk there yourself. That is a recurring pattern in life. The penalty finds you automatically. The benefit often requires an application. If you remember nothing else from what I am saying, remember that the penalty finds you automatically. The benefit often requires an application. That single sentence explains a surprising amount of personal finance in America. A retiree may spend years paying full freight because nobody told them a local exemption existed. Another may fall behind because a delinquency notice was ignored during a season of illness and confusion. Another may not understand that the redemption window is not a philosophical concept. It is a calendar. Older homeowners do not usually lose the house because they made one dramatic, foolish move. They lose it because paperwork moved faster than they did. That is the real enemy, not just fraud, not just debt, not just taxes. Speed. Bad systems move fast when you are unprepared. Good systems make you faster than the threat. That is why I think of these 5 documents not as administrative chores, but as speed tools. The Homestead Declaration speeds your legal protection. The Fraud Alert speeds your awareness. The Enhanced Title Review speeds your defense against future forgery. The Trust speeds transition and reduces probate drag. The Tax and Exemption Review speeds correction before delinquency becomes seizure risk. Once you frame it this way, the whole topic becomes clearer. You are not filing random paperwork. You are buying time before trouble becomes expensive. Now, let me tell you the mistake I would avoid above all others. Do not turn this into a someday project. The house is paid off. You feel relief. You say you will get to it after the holidays, after your next trip, after tax season, after your daughter visits, after you organize the filing cabinet, after you find the old closing papers, after you feel more energetic. That is how years disappear. And with each passing year, the equity rises, the vulnerability rises, and the odds improve for the wrong person to notice what you failed to protect. I do not say that to frighten you. I say it because delay is the default destroyer of ordinary wealth. People imagine financial ruin as something dramatic. Often it is just delayed maintenance on important decisions. I built a great deal of my life on patience. Patience is one of the finest tools in investing. But patience is not the same thing as procrastination. You want patience when compounding is working for you. You do not want patience when your legal and property protections are still missing. That is where decisiveness belongs. If I were speaking to a homeowner over 60 with a paid-off house, I would say this as plainly as I could. Do not confuse ownership with protection. Do not confuse lack of mortgage with lack of risk. Do not confuse public records with safety. Do not confuse a title policy from years ago with present protection. Do not confuse a trust document with a funded trust. Do not confuse paying property taxes for years with being sure you claimed every exemption and know every deadline. And above all, do not confuse I meant to do it with it is done. In my experience, the distance between those two phrases has swallowed an enormous amount of family wealth. There is another point here that I think matters, especially for older people who feel overwhelmed by modern. None of these documents make you weak. None of these steps are acts of fear. They are acts of stewardship. There is dignity in stewardship. A person who spent 40 years making the payments, maintaining the property, skipping luxuries, and choosing responsibility over impulse does not dishonor that life by taking legal precautions. They honor it. You are not acting paranoid when you lock what you spent a lifetime building. You are acting proportionately. And proportion is the heart of sound judgment. I also think people need to hear something else. You do not need to be rich to do this well. That is one of the most poisonous myths in asset protection. People think only the very wealthy use structures, filings, alerts, attorneys, exemptions, and trust planning. That is nonsense. The wealthy do not preserve wealth because complexity loves them. They preserve wealth because they treat protection as routine. What destroys ordinary households is not always lack of opportunity. Often it is the belief that serious structure is something other people use. I have never believed that. I have always believed that the ordinary family has more to lose from preventable disorder than the billionaire does. The billionaire can survive one stupid legal bill. The ordinary retiree may never recover from it. The billionaire can absorb administrative friction. The ordinary widow may lose months of sleep, years of savings, and a degree of confidence that never really returns. That is why I would urge urgency here, not panic. Urgency. Panic is noisy and confused. Urgency is quiet and effective. Urgency makes a checklist. Urgency makes the call. Urgency opens the county website. Urgency checks whether a homestead filing exists. Urgency signs up for the fraud alert. Urgency calls the title company. Urgency asks the estate attorney whether the trust is funded. Urgency checks whether the house is actually titled the way the documents claim it is. Urgency calls the assessor and asks what senior exemptions are available. Urgency opens every tax letter. Urgency refuses to let paperwork become destiny. If you do that, something very important happens. The house stops being an exposed vault and starts becoming a defended asset. It becomes harder to target, harder to impair, harder to delay, harder to steal, harder to attach carelessly. That is not just legal progress. That is emotional progress. Because one of the greatest gifts of late life planning is not merely the preservation of dollars. It is the preservation of calm. A well-protected home does not just sit on the balance sheet differently. It sits in the mind differently. You sleep differently. When you know the easy vulnerabilities are closed, you age differently when you are not unknowingly sitting on administrative landmines, and your family inherits something better than a house. They inherit order. I want to end where I began. A paid-off house is a beautiful thing. But beauty without structure attracts problems. A home can be the center of memory, sacrifice, and identity, and still be dangerously underdefended in the eyes of the law and the systems around it. If you are over 60, your job is no longer only to own the asset. Your job is to harden the perimeter. You do that with paper. You do that with filings. You do that with alerts. You do that with title review. You do that with trust structure. You do that with tax awareness and exemption claims. You do that by deciding that the long work of your life deserves one more afternoon of seriousness. That is what I would do. I would not admire the equity and hope for the best. I would not trust the system to remind me. I would not assume the county, the title office, or the tax authority exists to think on my behalf. I would go document by document and close every obvious gap, because losing a house rarely begins with one enormous catastrophe. Most of the time it begins with one missing form, one ignored notice, one absent alert, one old assumption, one deed that was never moved, one protection that was always going to be handled next month. That is how people lose what took them 40 years to build. And that is exactly why I would not leave it to chance.